This is a campaign and this is a movement about compassion, about humanity, about caring for one another. This is a campaign about human values, values that we can all be proud of. This is a campaign about love, not a campaign about deceit or bitterness or regret. You are a part of history. You are a part of the turning of America. And tonight I have the proud opportunity of introducing to you one of the most courageous men in America, introducing to you an American hero of the First Order, introducing to you a man who had the courage to step forward, a man who has consistently had the courage to raise his voice in behalf of the truth of what's really happening in this country so that this country can be a better place. When Nelson Mandela was in prison, nobody ever dreamed that he would become the president of his country. When Václav Havel, that's right, when Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia was in prison, nobody ever believed that he would be the president of his country. Nobody ever believed that Corazon Aquino would become the president of her country in the Philippines. Tonight is the beginning. This campaign is the beginning of a movement that is going to change this country forever. Millions of people will go to the streets Millions of people will go to the streets in this country peacefully, and America will be changed forever, and America will become a beautiful country. I have the honor tonight of introducing a man who someday all of us hope will be the next President of the United States, Ralph Nader. Thank you very much.
California. All night. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, welcome to the politics of joy and justice, as we call it. Thank you. And thank you, Ron, for those wonderful sentiments. To be introduced by a man of such courage, resiliency, optimism is really a great honor. And I want to thank you, Ron, again for that. And Phil Donahue, the great tribune of the First Amendment. Is there anybody in American life in the 20th century who has given more voice to more dissidents' views, more views that were once anathema and that are now the commonplace? The anathema of yesterday becomes the commonplace of today. Oh. The women's rights movement got their first national television expression through numerous Donahue shows. The struggle of labor against downsizing, loss of jobs overseas, the famous shows from Flint, Michigan, the Donahue shows. the consumer movement, environmental, the gay lesbian movement, the minority struggle for civil rights, the struggle against the war in Vietnam. All of them and many more were first on the Donahue Show, beamed to millions of Americans. I salute Phil Donahue for that enormous contribution to American society. And so many other people who preceded me on the program tonight. Patty Smith is always there with such steadfastness. But I want to single out Jackson Browne and tell you a story about Jackson Browne. When we were struggling against the expansion of nuclear power plants in this country in the early 70s and in the late 70s, we had these huge rallies. I mean, 150,000 people in Washington on the Mall and 200,000 people in Lower Manhattan. And at the time, the government and the nuclear power industry were predicting, catch this, by this year, there would be 1,000 nuclear plants all over the United States, and there would be 100 in California on the coast, all the way from San Diego up to the Oregon border, averaging 1 every 10 miles. We, at the time, developed a coalition, had training seminars with thousands of people, learning the facts about nuclear power, the costs, the risks, the evacuation problems, the radioactive waste unknowns, etc. And it was Jackson Browne and Bonnie Raitt and others who were right there at these giant rallies as the tribunes, as the cultural tribunes in this struggle. And instead of 1,000 nuclear plants, there are now 128, and they are being closed one after the other. And Greg Kafuri, who was up here asking you for your contributions, he was too modest to mention that he led the drive in Oregon again and again until that Trojan nuclear plant shut down. These plants are so horrifically costly, quite apart from the catastrophic risk, that they kept making you pay again and again for them, like the stranded cost electricity regulation that kicked in San Diego this summer and drove the electric bill from $40 to over $120 per household. So you can see that when movements start, the naysayers emerge, the doubters emerge, the wafflers emerge, the waverers emerge, the people who say it can't be done emerge, the people who say, well, let's just nibble at it emerge. Well, those of you in this great arena are not any of these. You are going to be, and you are, the pioneers for a major political reform movement in this country, all the way to Washington. We have run this campaign in 50 states, and right from the beginning, our platform has been guided by a single principle, a principle that flows from the lessons of history. Every social movement of justice in our country, and I might add, many around the world, was marked by a shift of power from the few to the many. A shift of power where the few could no longer unilaterally decide for the many in ways, of course, that favored the few, the rich, the powerful, and in today's parlance, the global corporation. The shift of power has many manifestations to it, which I'll outline briefly. But the one manifestation that is the most important is the desire by the people to want that power hard enough that they're willing to work for it, to sweat for it, and to stay the course for it. back in our country's history, that was first expressed by the Revolution of 1776. By the way, 1/3 were Tories, and they liked King George. 1/3 of the people here were no-comment people, they would be called today, and 1/3 were the revolutionaries and the supporters. Once again, there were the doubters and the waverers and the wafflers. But the ones who persisted and the ones who now claim the honor for what they did in history are the ones who stood fast, who didn't settle for lesser of two evils or the least of the worst. They stood fast, and a few years later, the rise of the abolitionist movement against slavery, when the dominant business community, just like the dominant business community didn't want the revolution, the dominant business community, the cotton and other giant plantations, had human beings as slaves. And the anti-slavery movement started, and it started with the third party shortly thereafter. And the anti-slavery movement didn't settle for the lesser of two evils. They didn't go around saying, well, let's not take on those powerful cotton plantations too much now. They didn't say, well, let's just compromise, let's just free the slaves over 65, for starters. Abolitionists were for abolition of one of the two most monstrous crimes ever committed on the North American continent, the other being the genocide of the first Native Americans. And now, to be sure, it took a civil war, but it was a shift of power nonetheless, from the few to more of the many. The women's right to vote was a shift of power. It wasn't only men that didn't want women to vote. It was the industrial giants of the time. It was the liquor industry. It was a lot of industries who didn't want women to have the vote because they were already mobilizing against brutalized child labor in dungeon factories. They wanted children to go to school, not to have their bodies and health twisted in order to increase the profit of avaricious manufacturers. And they didn't settle for a partial right to vote. They moved for the total right to vote. They wanted it, and they fought for it. And then came the workers' turn in the Industrial Revolution. And today we can't begin to think how brutalized those conditions were. In the mines, foundries, factories, fumes, particulates, legs cut off, bodies crushed. It was carnage. There are more coal miners who lost their lives in the mines since 1890 to the present time. From black lung disease, coal miners' pneumoconiosis, breathing coal dust, and from mine shaft collapses. More coal miners lost their lives than all the Americans killed in World War II. And that's just one industry. And these workers wanted unions to represent them, to fight for them, for better wages and working conditions. And they persisted until they shifted power from these giant corporations and coal mine owners and barons more to the workers. So they got a decent standard of living. They shifted power and they persisted. And they didn't settle for least of the worst or the lesser of two evils. And then came the farmers out of East Texas in 1887, one of the great episodes in our history we don't read too much about in our classrooms. A great book, The Populist Moment by Professor Lawrence Goodwin, will give you the flavor. In 6 months, these farmers, dirt poor with only their hearts, head, and feet, organized 200,000 of themselves in 6 Texas counties, drew $1 each in dues, equivalent to $50 now. Dirt poor farmers squeezed by the banks and high interest rates for loans, squeezed by the giant railroads and high freight rates. And they roared out of East Texas, and in 25 years swept over the country. And they elected their senators and representatives and almost the president and state legislators and governors and gave us the greatest political reform movement of our history. And they didn't settle for less. They wanted it badly, and they drove for it and got it. At one time they were offered charity to help them feed their families. And they said, in so many words, a society that has more justice is a society that needs less charity. And they drove for that justice. And so, in the 20th century, similar movements by people who wanted justice badly, the second wave of the women's rights movement, the consumer environmental movement, the great civil rights movement, the gay and lesbian movement, the Americans with Disability movement. Imagine, they now have access to buildings and to jobs. And you know, nobody gave that to them. In their wheelchairs, they occupied public buildings. They demonstrated. And look at them now. They're into the Special Olympics. They're climbing cliffs, showing the infinite potential of human possibilities and the spirit of the human being. The civil rights movement. Just think of what it must have been, by the way, to have been a fighter against slavery in 1830 in Mississippi. And you think you're up against overwhelming odds? They got caught. They were lynched. And in the civil rights movement of the 20th century, they were whipped and beaten and put upon by dogs and sheriffs taking them to jail. What was their crime? They wanted to go to a lunch counter and have a sandwich. They wanted to have a drink at a drinking water fountain. They wanted to go to the restrooms. They wanted a job opportunity. They wanted equal pay for equal sweat. They wanted to go to schools in the neighborhoods that weren't segregated. They wanted to have credit opportunity and small business loans and U.S. Department of Agriculture loans to black farmers who were driven off the land by vicious discriminatory practices that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is now going to have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to the remaining black farmers. You know, when we're looking for motivation today, look back at history. Think of those 4 black freshman engineering students in North Carolina who marched to a lunch counter that said whites only, sat down and ordered their meal. The owner called the police. The police arrested them, took them off to jail. They got lawyers. They took the case to the district court, Circuit Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, 9-0 decision on their behalf, ruling that nobody can be discriminated on basis of their race for access to any public accommodations in our country. Now we come to the present state of affairs. And you look around and you say, what must these forebears of ours think of these people in Washington, these Republicans, these Democrats, these diminished political careerists, 2 of whom we saw on 3 debates, waffling and wallowing and puffing and strutting and agreeing with one another in the second debate 32 times. And afraid to take a stand, afraid to provide a vision for the country and the world. When they were asked about foreign policy, they couldn't even say, well, I think our government should launch a massive assault on global infectious diseases because we're the richest country and the most medically advanced country, and we're letting millions of children and adults die all over the world from malaria and tuberculosis and AIDS. They couldn't even say something like that. True. We have, by our default, by our staying home and not voting, by our not engaging enough, with few exceptions, in the passions and justice of our time, we have allowed these diminished politicians to not only diminish us, but to diminish our government, to diminish our democracy, and to sell off our government and our democracy and our elections to these corporations who fund their elections in return for political favors that turn our own government against its own people. This is what we have to contend with. Part of it is our default. We've got to end this passivity. end this sense of powerlessness which leads to apathy, end this sophisticated cynicism where young people say, well, we're not turned on politics, to whom I reply, look at history, young people. Look what happens in history when people aren't turned on to politics. Politics was originally the antidote to tyranny. That's why it was established. Look at the dictatorships, look at the brutality. Look at the crushing of life's possibilities when people do not turn on to politics and strengthen that democracy and build those tools of democracy. You don't turn on to politics? Then right down to the air you breathe, the crowded highways you curse, the water you drink, the racial profiling you detest, the health insurance your parents may not have. Politics will turn on you. These politicians sell our country short for career advancement funded by avaricious corporations. And we have let them sell our country short because you and I both know that an aroused, mobilized, informed, motivated citizenry, there is no power in this country that can begin to stop that kind of popular movement. The reassertion of the sovereignty of the people in place of the sovereignty of the corporate supremacists over our political economy, over our government, our workplace, our marketplace, over our environment, over our human genes, over our personal privacy, over our own children who are mercilessly exploited by these commercial marketeers, over the very ability of our country to recycle your taxes to meet the needs of the many rather than the demands of the few rich and powerful. All of this is what happens when we lose control. And you talk to people around the country, and it doesn't matter what they label themselves politically, they all understand that they've lost control. They've lost bargaining power. They've lost negotiating power. And let me illustrate that in ways perhaps that may resonate with your own experience. There are 47 million workers in this country who work for less than $10 an hour, and they work full-time. Many of them at $5.15 an hour, federal minimum wage, $6, $7, $8, $9 an hour, and then you subtract the cost of going to work, another used car, another auto insurance policy, another repair bill, more daycare expenses. How can you live as a 45-year-old woman, mother of one, told me a few months ago? She goes 8 miles every day to go to work at Walmart, and I asked her, how much do you make? And she says $6.60 an hour. This is a disgrace. This company is drowning in its own profits. Its executives are making millions of dollars a year. Its stock is booming on the sweat and back of repressed workers in their stores. Here, the Green Party moves to build a drive in this country to once and for all repeal the chokehold law on tens of millions of Americans, obstructing their formation of free democratic trade unions, to countervail the power of these corporations, to repeal the notorious Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And replace it with labor laws that give workers a decent opportunity to circulate petitions and form their trade unions, at least as decent as workers have in Western European governments and in Canada. There is no country in the Western world that places more obstacles in front of workers trying to form unions than the United States government under the influence of these corporate lobbies. We're down to less than 10% of workers in the private workforce unionized. That is the lowest in 60 years, and it shows, doesn't it? It shows in non-living wages. It shows in the lack of the minimum wage going up to inflation. If it did, according to 1968 levels, it would be $7.30 an hour. People in 1968 purchasing power were making $7.30 an hour. And now people are making $5.15 an hour. And the economy has doubled in output per capita, and productivity has increased over 60%. And workers today, a majority of them are making less in real purchasing dollars than 20 and 25 years ago. That is a sign of too much power in too few hands. It's a sign of what Thomas Jefferson warned us against, what Abraham Lincoln warned us against, what Woodrow Wilson warned us against. The Green Party pledges for strong enforcement of occupational safety and health laws. Look at the way these politicians in Washington, they still deny, most of them, carpal tunnel syndrome. I said to some of them, you know, why don't you go and sit behind the computer and work 8 hours a day and see what your wrists and fingers are like after 10 weeks. Maybe then you'll feel it. In 8 years under Clinton Gore, the Job Safety Agency has not issued one chemical toxic control standard to protect workers in the workplace. 56,000 workers lose their lives every year from occupational hazards, exposures, particulates, toxics, and trauma. That can be compared with 15,600 fatalities from homicides last year. Horrendous rate, highest in the Western world, but compare that with 56,000 largely preventable deaths among workers in our country. We're losing control now as voters, because although both parties say, gee, you know, this business of raising money from these fat cats, we really don't like it. Dianne Feinstein says she doesn't like it if she raises $25 million, and will not debate Medea Benjamin. Can you imagine her debating Medea Benjamin? Did you hear Medea Benjamin? Talk about what could have been a spectacular upset, huh? Well, someday we'll have our own radio and TV stations and cable channels that belong to the people of the United States, and a senator like Dianne Feinstein will have to debate. She won't have the luxury of having this great candidate, Medea Benjamin, blacked out by the newspapers in this state. Not one feature article on her in the whole campaign as she's gone up and down the state of California. Now, here's what the Green Party intends to press for. Public funding of public campaigns, and mean it. Free TV and radio time for all ballot qualified candidates, and mean it. And why do they mean it? Because they're living it. They're practicing what they preach, so they can preach what we practice. We are taking no corporate money for our campaign, no crooked soft money for our campaign, although it's been offered, no PAC money for our campaign, only individual contributions such as those that you have made this evening. That's the way we practice what we preach and set an example for those two political parties. Republicans and Democrats say they want campaign finance reform. They don't want to unilaterally disarm unless the other party does. Oh, that's real leadership, isn't it? That's really leading by moral example. Well, the Green Party has unilaterally disarmed in order to set an example for the political system in this country. The Green Party stands 50 years after President Truman proposed universal health care coverage to an obstructive Congress. The Green Party says it is about time in wave 2 for universal health care coverage that's accessible and emphasizes prevention of disease and trauma in the United States of America for everybody. Why don't we have it? We don't have it because the corporations are collapsing our democracy and putting their hooks deeper into both political parties. The HMOs are doing it, the hospital chains, the giant drug and pharmaceutical companies. And so many of these changes that can be ours because we do have the wealth, we do have the science, we do have the technology, we do have the Constitution, but it's the big corporations that have our politicians and our elected representatives. And we have got to break those chains and say to those politicians, if you don't start bending to the will of an informed citizenry instead of the avaricious greed of giant corporations, you're out of there. Look how we're losing power as consumers. We all know it. I mean, now if you look at a bill and you try to decipher it, you can't figure it out, and you think you're being overcharged, and you say to yourself, well, should I complain? Do I have the time to complain? Well, after a while you say no, because here's what happened the first time. You hit that 1-800 number, and then you heard a robot say, press 1 if, press 2, press 3. You press 3, you get another. Press 1, press 2, and then you hit the stone wall where someone says, your business is very important to us. But our representatives are handling other customer inquiries. Would you please stay on hold? So you stay on hold, then they hit you with the ads, or they hit you with music. Maybe not of your own choosing. This has gotten so predictable that some years ago, when I'm working late at night and I want to listen to classical music, I just dialed United Airlines. There's a recent cover of Business Week magazine on customer service. It was pretty chilling. These corporations are going to give you a number. It's going to be called the credit score. There'll be all kinds of private information in your database, not under your control. You don't even know if it's accurate. Whirling around the world, who's buying it, who's using it, what employer is saying no to you when you apply for a job or insurance company. They've got now computer banks where if you're misfortunate enough or because of the way they sequence your checks, you get a few bounce checks, your name goes in, you don't have a checking account, you go to other banks, you are on the blacklist. You cannot get a checking account. We're talking about millions of Americans now. This was reported recently in either the New York Times or the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. And it gets worse, of course. When was the last time you were ever able to change a standard form contract? Huh? Here's an example. You've all signed landlord leases and auto insurance policies and you know, maybe HMO agreements and bank signature cards and auto dealer sales purchase agreements or installment loan agreements at Sears. And you know what happens. You make your selection, you go up, they check your credit, check that computer bank there, and they shuffle the papers, and then they give you a pen, right? They give you a nice pen, and they say, sign on the dotted line. That's what we do in America today. We are put on hold, and we sign on the dotted line. And of course, if you ever try to do the reverse, you will see how little there is left of freedom of contract. You will see how you are signing on to fine print clauses that strip you of your constitutional right for a trial by jury and to go to court, because they'll say you gave it up, you signed on the dotted line. It's called binding arbitration. Now let's see, suppose you go down to buy a car, and the dealer is, you know how they do it, they pack this on and that on and so on and so forth. They actually have spotters on the mezzanines, you know, looking at your body language to see whether you can be had. Anyway, so they say, okay, sign, thank you, here, sign, we check your credit. And you say, you know, I'm sorry, My mommy and daddy told me never to sign anything I didn't read. You got a chair so I can sit down. You know, the salesperson is saying, what is this? You know? But, you know, they're resilient, these salespeople. And, okay, here's a chair. You sit down, you take out your pen and your little magnifying glass, and you go to work. And you start reading. There are things you don't like. You double the warranty. Here, you cross out a paragraph. You X out a penalty. You wipe out the binding arbitration clause. And you put your little initials in the corner, and you go back to the salesperson and say, I think we got a deal on this car. Sign on the dotted line, boy. Someday the Green Party is going to give you a country where you don't have to unilaterally sign on the dotted line, and where with other consumers you can collectively bargain for a pro-consumer contract, not a contract that puts chains around you and then dares you to do anything about it. You know, we put out a book once called An Action Manual for Lemon Owners, you know, car owners. And at the end we had a prototype, nice, consumer-oriented purchase agreement. We told people when you go buy a car, have them sign it and tell us what happened. The first person who wrote back said he went down, he picked out the car, he put it down, put this agreement down and said to the salesman, I've got it all printed for you, signed. The salesman was kind of astonished, runs to the head dealer manager, tells him what happened. You know what the dealer manager did? He called the police. Another time, a guy went in and the salesman chased him out of the dealer showroom, calling him a dirty communist. Now, this is not just dollars and cents. This goes to the quality of the consumer service. It goes to whether you're going to have high-quality hospitalization, whether you're going to get credit for your small business or for your own consumer purchases. There's a lot at stake here. Health, safety, economic rights. You see, we've been stripped of our rights. But if our expectation level is low, then why would we think anything can change? And isn't that really an interesting point? That if we keep our expectation levels down because the powers that be are expert at keeping our expectations down. They sold us years ago cars that were killing people by the tens of thousands because they didn't let us know that their engineers had seat belts and padded dash panels and collapsing steering columns and head restraints and airbags and side impact protection so that we could survive these crashes without injury or only minimal injury. So naturally, when we went to the showroom, we didn't know about what kind of car we could have bought, and so they controlled our expectation level as we pursued gas-guzzling, chrome-bedecked monsters that were horrendous to repair. And it's that low expectation level that becomes a controlling process all by itself. That's why we say information is the currency of democracy. Because when you know what you can have that you don't have, you're going to want to have it. Now look how powerless we are as taxpayers. How many times have you heard taxpayers having to fork up the money to build stadiums, arenas, and ballparks in cities where schools and clinics and public transit systems are crumbling for lack of money to repair and upgrade them? The bastion of global capitalism is the New York Stock Exchange. It has an old building. It decided it wanted land and a new building. Now, if it was a real capitalist, it would raise money, investors, build a new building, and try to make it go. But of course now, it's not capitalism, it's corporate socialism. And the New York Stock Exchange representatives paid a visit to the mayor, Giuliani, in New York City, and they said, Mayor, you know, we've been here for well over 150 years, and we love New York City, but we've been taking a look at New Jersey across the Hudson River. And we might just go to New Jersey if we do not have adequate incentives to stay in New York City. So the frightened mayor anteed up a mere $500 million for this bastion of global capitalism. And New York Stock Exchange said, yeah, okay, that's good enough. We may get some more from you if you'll be a little bit more generous, and we will not become the Hoboken Stock Exchange in New Jersey. I was on the floor of the Stock Exchange a few weeks ago, and I was having a chat with a couple of market makers, one of them 47 years at work, and the other 50. One of them was about to retire. And I said, really, was it credible? Did anybody in the stock exchange believe that the people at the top were going to move the stock exchange to New Jersey? One guy was eating a sandwich and he dropped it. He was laughing so hard. And the other guy told me baloney. It never was going to happen. But do you know that there are all kinds of needs in poor neighborhoods in New York City that would never get the time of day from the mayor and the frightened politicians who kneel before these corporate extortionists? That $500 million should have gone to the clinics and the schools and the drinking water system and the libraries and a little culture. Now, by the way, the stock exchange hasn't started building this building because they've suddenly realized they don't need all that space because of computerization. But they still demanded it. And how about Governor Whitman? And she got a couple $100 million for a spur highway for a new gambling casino in Atlantic City. Have you been in New Jersey lately? Have you seen how much is crumbling in New Jersey? The water pollution and the drinking water problems and the schools and the public buildings. But it's okay. $200 million there. You know what's interesting about corporate welfare? Not only that local, state, and national, it's hundreds of billions of dollars a year to the pharmaceutical industry, the military contracting industry, the giant agribusiness industry, every corporation of any size, gimme, gimme, gimme. They're bailed out. They're given our medical research and development free, and then the drug companies sock it to you in terms of drug prices. It's a huge scandal, but what it comes down to, it's a great sucking sound of your tax dollars into the coffers of giant corporations who don't need it, and away from the people of this country who do need it. And the Green Party wants to end corporate welfare as we know it. Both Bush and Gore are for the World Trade Organization and NAFTA. Let's hear it again for the media here. You're looking at the only presidential candidate who's actually read those two documents. And here's what they are. Here's what they are. They're international systems of autocratic governance. They subordinate non-commercial value systems like health, safety, workplace, environment, consumer protection to the imperatives of international commerce. And when the U.S. has higher standards than a lot of other countries, like food labeling and auto safety and pollution control and mammal protection, that other countries think are restricting imports into our country, they take us to Geneva in Switzerland under the World Trade Organization's courts, which are closed to all the press, and which have no public transcript, and which have no independent appeal, and we lose. Because it's trade over alles. We have lost 5 straight foreign country challenges to our environmental standards, including the tuna dolphin case. And this is what's going to happen. This is a slow-motion coup d'etat, relinquishing our local and state and national sovereignties to these international secretive bodies that are completely contradictory to the way we run our courts, the way we run our open administrative agencies, and the way we have progressed in this country, because whenever we have progressed, we have subordinated the commercial instinct to the abolition of child labor, to environmental health, to civil rights, equal pay for equal work, to worker health and safety. Now we belong to an international structure that puts commerce first and all these other values last. You cannot bind Los Angeles a product in this country made by child labor in this country because it's illegal. But we are obliged by our membership in the World Trade Organization to make sure that we allow the importation of products from brutalized child labor in third world countries. That is the kind of trade agreement that pulls standards down, doesn't pull standards up. And the Green Party pledges to initiate the provided for 6-month notice of withdrawal from WTO and NAFTA and renegotiate these trade agreements to pull standards upward. Look at what kind of influence do we have as a people on our military budget compared to Raytheon, Boeing, Martin Marietta, and their merger with Lockheed that cost you $1.5 billion for a wedding present from the Pentagon? We don't have a say. What these companies do, these defense contractors, in order to bloat the military budget for their own profit, in order to build gold-plated weapons that are no longer strategically needed now that the Soviet Union is no more 10 years ago, they are pumping this money by pouring campaign contributions to the House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services Committee, and that money can be better used. It can be better used for really redefining national security as going after global infectious diseases, going after massive environmental degradation, going after a foreign policy that creates problems for itself because we always align ourselves with the oppressors in these countries instead of democratic forces in these countries. Yes, indeed. Military budget for national defense needs only, not for corporate procurement needs. Now, how many times has the major press investigated this and revealed it and exposed it? The Times, LA Times, New York Times, AP, 60 Minutes, 2020, Wall Street Journal, and nothing happened. The enormous waste in that budget, nothing happened. That shows you what a weak democracy we have compared to the power of the plutocrats and the corporate supremacists. And that's what we have to change. We have to have a military budget that is now being developed by retired Army generals and Navy admirals who are true patriots and don't go into the military contract business after they retire from the Pentagon, and they have the most severe criticism of the way this military budget is being bloated and wasted and how it's being misallocated. Well, we do need more power as voters through public funding of public campaigns and as workers through trade union organizations. Tens of millions more workers can be in trade unions. We need consumer power so we can salvage the value of the family budget and advance the health and safety. We need tough law and order against corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. We do need if I were to say crime, violence, welfare, and regulation, what would you think of in your mind? You think of government regulation, poverty, welfare? You think of street crime? You think of burglaries? Well, corporate crime steals far more from you, staggeringly more from you, than street crime. The General Accounting Office estimated 10% of your health care dollar goes down the drain through billing, fraud, and abuse. Just billing, fraud, and abuse. That's $110 billion this year with a B. Corporate crime in terms of deaths, injuries, diseases, massive. 100,000 people in just from misprescribing or overprescribing prescription drugs in this country. 65,000 Americans die, according to the EPA, from air pollution in this country. Tens of thousands die from defective and dangerous products, of which the Firestone Tire Ford Explorer is just one small, highly publicized tragedy. Indeed, we have 80,000 people die from gross malpractice in our hospitals, according to the Harvard School of Public Health studies. And when it comes to welfare, nothing can compare with corporate welfare. You know, a $300 a month welfare mother, she's facing a 5-year cutoff. There is no cutoff for corporate welfare under present laws. But under the Green Party, there'll be more than a cutoff. There'll be an abolition telling them to stand up on your own 2 feet and sink and swim as capitalism tells you to do. A word about the rural small family farm and rural country. It's in its greatest challenge in its history. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Clinton Gore administration, the Republicans in Congress, are shoveling tax money to save some of the farmers, but they are allowing the giant agribusiness companies, the big meat packing, the big pork companies, chicken processors, the grain companies like Cargill and IBP and ADM and all the others to squeeze the life out of the price that these farmers get working from dawn to dusk for their wheat, soy, cotton, for their cattle, for their chickens. And you know what? They're going out of business every week by the hundreds. We now have more people in prison than we have farmers in this country. We have a situation where factory farms herding these animals together, pumping it full of antibiotics, some of which end up in your stomach. We have industrial agriculture, monoculture, not caring multiculture. We have contract agriculture instead of the market agriculture. And it's turning our farmers into peons, into serfs. Big crisis. Want to find out more about it? Log in to competitivemarkets.com. We've got to do something about this because although we live in cities and suburbs, let's contemplate what America will be like without rural life, rural society, and a small farm economy. Lots of talk about education. George W. Bush is always talking about education. I wondered why, and then I learned it's because he needs so much of it. Yes, indeed. One thing about education is not really being discussed, and that's what are the children learning. And I suggest if they have a core civic curriculum where they learn about their community, and they learn about the economy and the geography and the culture and the government, and they learn citizen skills, and they learn how to practice democracy, and that will really motivate them, and then they'll learn reading, writing, and arithmetic as a byproduct. So much work for a democracy to do. So much work that a democracy can do if the democracy is given a chance. But if it is collapsing and resulting in our loss of control over all things that matter to us, we're not going to solve the problem. We're not going to prevent the injustices. Our energy situation is at a crisis point. Global warming, ozone depletion, geopolitical conflict, more and more oil imported, more and more radioactive waste that doesn't know where to be put for 200,000 years, more strip mining, more land erosion, and here we have the solution that's been around for centuries, over 2,000 years ago. The East Africans and ancient Greeks and ancient Persians built their structures with some modifications that might be called passive solar architecture. Centuries ago, windmills powered the little local economy. Solar thermal, photovoltaic prices are dropping. The Navy's installing 20,000 units in remote locations for economic reasons, not just environmental reasons. And why don't we have an accelerating conversion from the globe destroying being used at an accelerating rate around the world, a conversion into solar energy in all its manifestations, including wind power? Because the big oil, the big gas, the big coal, and the big nuclear companies say no, and the politicians obey them. And they get the subsidies to those industries from our tax dollars, and the lobbyists swarm all over energy policy in America. The Green Party says that this country must lead the world in solar energy, and it means it.